So let's dive in and get started. We're here today talking about our latest World's Best Cities rankings. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the report, you can go to worldsbestcities.com and download that report or share it with others. Obviously, these rankings are get a lot of attention and stir a lot of emotion for people when we release them, and hopefully we'll have some interesting questions and conversation about that. And I always love the passion that people have for places and for cities, and love to dive into that with you. So just as a bit of a background, Resonance, our company, is a global advisor specializing in placemaking, place branding, and place marketing for tourism destinations, for cities, and for communities around the world. Our clients range from places like Canada and Saudi Arabia to Ireland to Brussels to Christchurch in New Zealand to Pittsburgh to Los Angeles, Vancouver, many different places in between. And the thing that all of these places have in common is when we work with them is just trying to understand, what are their key strengths or key weaknesses as it relates to tourism development, economic development, urban development. That really is answering those questions is really what led us to creating the Best Cities methodology over the last 10 years. And the fundamental question in all of these projects, whether we're looking at how do we attract more visitors to a particular place, how do we attract talent to a particular city, or how do we think about attracting residents to a community or a district within a city, is this idea about how do we measure the performance of place, going beyond just the quantitative measures with respect to number of visitors or number of jobs or the economic impact, of looking at some of the qualitative factors that are driving those outcomes and those results. So when you think about benchmarking a place, really there's a variety of different ways of looking at it. One is as a place to live. If you're thinking about moving to a particular city, you would have one set of criteria and decision factors that you would be considering in making that location decision. Another is in thinking about it as a place to visit, in terms of if you're going on vacation to a particular city, where would you be thinking about some different factors would go into that decision-making process. And lastly would be thinking about a place as a place to invest, or do business. Those would have a different set of criteria and decision factors. So as we think about best cities, part of what makes one city better than another depends on your perspective and your point of view. And the challenge is that we think about understanding place is some of these factors overlap with one another. And that's really been our work over the last decade with the Best Cities platform, is trying to understand and create a holistic model to understand how to benchmark place attractiveness and competitive identity from one place to another. So what we've looked at in the rankings, and we'll talk through today, is looking at through the lens of livability, thinking again about a place as a place to live, prosperity from an economic perspective in terms of jobs, investment, attraction, and this third pillar of place that we call lovability, which really speaks to the vibrancy and the experiential quality of a city or a place that are primarily the factors that drive visitation from a leisure tourism perspective. So this methodology, as we look at best cities and the rankings that we'll talk through, is based on trying to understand what are the factors that have the highest correlation with attracting prime age population to live in a city, or attracting visitor expenditure, or looking at business formation as it relates to the economy and the prosperity of a city. And this is just some of the highlights of the factors. If we went back to 2019, of looking at factors that had correlations with attracting talent, that prime age population. Not surprising, there would be things like job opportunities, the number of Fortune 500 companies, museums. Interestingly, the number of professional sports teams showed high correlations with where prime age population was moving. And this is based on an analysis of cities in the United States. And of course, if it was, visitors you were looking at, hotels, convention centers, obviously have strong relationship with visitor expenditure. In the bottom, when you think about business formation, there was venture capital. Immigration was a key factor that shows high correlation with business formation in U.S. cities, the ranking of the university, health and tech employment, the safety of the city. And then you see there's some factors here that overlapped with one another. At the top, restaurants, airport connectivity, sites and landmarks showed strong relationships both with visitor expenditure and prime age population. And you can see things like nightlife actually having a relationship, not just with attracting talent, but actually the number of small businesses being formed in the city. And at the very nexus of this back in 2019 was culture. As we think about festivals, events, cultural experiences was actually showing a high correlation with visitation, with talent attraction, and business formation. Of course, that was 2019, and our world changed significantly in 2020. We all know what happened with COVID-19. And of course, now here we are, 4 years later almost, and there have been some structural changes, particularly in cities in the US, Canada, Northern Europe, and Australia, where we see, office occupancy is much less than it used to be. It's less than 20% still on Mondays and Fridays in the US, for example. At the same time, obviously, travel completely decimated in the pandemic. And then we see travel come back significantly and the expenditure. And now travel consumers are spending a larger share of their disposable income on travel and leisure, and that's expected to grow through this decade. And of course, if we're going into the office less, we're traveling more. Demand and prices for residential housing are at all-time highs, while demand for office space in many cities is at record lows, although we are seeing a recovery in many cities amongst Class A office space. And then, of course, you have all kinds of different investments, whether that's in the EU or in the US with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS investment in terms of investing in silicon chip production, clean energy, et cetera. This is creating investment in jobs in more suburban and exurban locations versus in city centers. So we wanted to update this analysis this year and looked at, well, what's driving people to places now? And again, this is focused on analysis of US cities. But what was interesting and the kind of the key takeaway coming out of that was the convergence of factors as it relates to business attraction, talent, visitors. So yes, there are some things like venture capital that only show correlations with business formation, and there's some things like hotels that only show correlations with visitor expenditure. Interestingly, broadband access now shows a correlation with where prime age population is locating, which makes sense. So as you think about more people working remotely, they need access to good high-speed internet. But the important takeaway is really the confluence of factors that have happened, and the shift here of looking at whether it's housing, whether it's culture, whether it's innovation, whether it's nightlife, that we're actually seeing a relationship now and a convergence of factors as it relates to visitor expenditure, talent attraction, and business formation. And this is really how we've developed the premise and how we select factors that go into the methodology that I'm going to walk you through today is by trying to uncover relationships between the outcomes that we're seeking and the underlying data that supports those outcomes. I think one of the takeaways of, okay, why has this confluence of factors happened is that, really the shift in the last few years coming out of this has been that now people have more choices to live or visit anywhere, but they want to live or visit somewhere. So these experiential qualities that we often thought about as just being related to tourism and destination development and attraction are now showing correlations with business formation and talent attraction, and vice versa, that a lot of the factors that are maybe driving talent choices are also showing relationships with respect to business formation. What we wanted to enhance this year as we looked at understanding not just the performance of place, which for the last 9 years, the rankings were based entirely on looking at these performance related factors that showed these correlations with these outcomes, was also trying to now incorporate, well, what about people's perception of cities as places to live, as places to visit, and as places to work? And we were excited to partner with Ipsos this year to conduct a global survey of households in 30 different countries, understand, well, what are their aspirations in terms of where they want to live? We talked a lot about cities or the end of cities, the flight away from cities during the pandemic. And we're curious to find out, well, how has that actually shaped people's or influenced their perception about where they want to live, visit, and work in the future? So the 2025 rankings are now our 10th edition, and they're focused, as always, on metropolitan areas with 1 million plus population. So often we get asked the question of, well, why is my city not in the ranking, et cetera? We do have a population threshold. We also have some data thresholds in terms of availability. And bottom line is we end up looking at around 267 cities that meet the criteria of a million plus metropolitan area population with enough data availability for the various factors that we're looking at. And as I mentioned, this year is the first year that we're now incorporating this perception data. There were no limits on the survey with Ipsos, so we were simply asking three questions. Which three cities would you most like to live in someday? Which three cities would you most like to visit in the next 12 to 24 months? And which three cities do you believe have the best job opportunities? So these were open-ended questions, a huge amount of work for Ipsos to then compile all those open-ended responses. But the survey, in terms of who we talked to for this and input, were 20,000 plus households in 30 countries. And as you look at this group of countries, they represent about 60% of the world's population, but 85% of the global economy. So this is a far-reaching survey as it relates to, particularly as we think about talent attraction, visitor attraction, expenditure, where that's coming from, or from the more affluent countries. So we wanted to have this coverage that is representative both geographically, but also economically. And I think one of the key takeaways out of the survey, or the highlight first coming out of that, was all this data came in, was that we had more than 700 cities were mentioned in the survey as places to live, as places people wanted to visit. So very diverse and broad. As you go around the world and you see huge regional variations, of course, if you're in Saudi Arabia, the criteria of the cities you want to visit is quite different than maybe from in China or in Canada or in the UK. And the same with cities to live and visit. So you have this very broad range of cities and towns that were mentioned in the survey. But what's interesting is that there were only 50 cities that were mentioned by 1% or more of the survey respondents. And I think this really speaks to the challenge of destination marketing, economic development, is that we have many, many different cities that are all competing for visitor attraction, for investment, but we only have a very small group of cities that are top of mind at a global level. And we'll get into some of the results of that here in a moment. So this bottom top line, if we looked at the survey results out of the 700 cities mentioned, these were the top 10, or the 10 that were mentioned the most. And these all had a 2% share. So 2% of the global survey population mentioned one of these 10 cities or more as the place they most wanted to visit. And you can see, Paris is at the top of the list there, followed by New York and London, Tokyo, Rome. City like Barcelona, relatively small compared to some of these other cities, but really packs outperforms. Then Berlin, Seoul, Singapore, and Sydney, quite popular. And again, this is when you look at and aggregate the global results. If we were to look at the Asia Pacific, you would get a different set of cities. Or if you looked at this just within Europe, you would get a slightly different set of cities again. But you continue from region to region, you do see the Paris, New York, London, Tokyo, near the tops of those lists. Here's where we look at a slightly different lens when we think about the cities people most want to live in. New York is at the top of the list, Paris, London, Tokyo. So you kind of have to see the same top five, but you do see cities like Sydney now moving up. That as attractive as Sydney is as a place to visit, it's perceived to be even more attractive as a place to live. And of course, we have Madrid, Barcelona in here. And you see Dubai now pops up here in the top 10 as a city that people want to live in. In fact, more people want to live in Dubai than visit, which was interesting just by a slight percentage point in the results of the survey. And lastly, looked at and think about from a job opportunities perspective. Again, you see the same top cities at the top: New York, London, Paris, Tokyo. You see Berlin moves up the list here. Singapore moves up the list. Dubai moves up the list. And you see a city like Los Angeles appear here in the top 10 in terms of the cities that people believe have the best job opportunities. So we can kind of line those up together. And again, this is just the perception data of the results of the survey. And you really do see that kind of common thread of the top four are relatively the same. Interestingly, when you look at Rome perceived as a very highly as a place to visit, as a place to live, but people don't see it as a place for job opportunities. So you do get these variations, whereas New York, Paris, London, and Tokyo are pretty consistent across all three spectrums of a place to visit, a place to live, and a place to work. We don't see that the same for Rome. And of course, Sydney is another city. You see it kind of move up and down. So more highly perceived as a place to live than as a place to work or visit. So that's just perception, which was an important new input to understand what is how was perception changed. And I think it was interesting that probably if we were able to run this survey back in 2019 and look back, I don't think that we would have seen major shifts. So as much as we were talking about the decline of cities and the flight away from the world's largest cities, this survey would tell us that people still see cities, large and the largest cities in the world, as some of the most desirable places to live, work, and visit. So I think in many ways, going through the pandemic and coming out of that we've kind of regressed back to the norm in terms of the desirability of largest cities in the world. So now let's look at our performance metrics, and these are going through the factors that we've incorporated to benchmark and score a city's livability, a city's lovability, and its prosperity. And I'll show you how these perception factors are being incorporated into that. So first, livability. When you think about livability, there's lots of different definitions of that. Again, we're looking at factors that have relationships with attracting prime age population. So that's looking at natural built environments, also some socioeconomic factors such as the affordability of housing in terms of monthly rents, cost to buy a median price of homes, etc. And there are also some interesting factors that, we have a blend here that we're looking at, which is not just housing, but also things like the bikeability of a city, emerging factors, particularly in North America and Europe, where we're starting to see the bike friendliness of cities showing relationship with where talent is migrating to. We look at things like sites and landmarks. So this comes from TripAdvisor, and it's not, when we talk about sites and landmarks, it's not just icons, but neighborhoods are many of the elements that make up sites and landmarks. Parks and recreation, so looking at parks and outdoor activities and experiences in a city. Also looking at environmental factors such as the tree cover, or looking at the air quality within a city. Then there can be some other elements that we look at, like healthcare system. This is, again, the perceived quality. We're using survey results from Numbeo global survey there, just to understand how do people from one part of the world perceive the quality of the healthcare in their particular city. I mentioned the price to income ratio of buying a median apartment or looking at average rent, and then also things like air quality in terms of the environmental aspect. And then perception. So those perception scores are coming in here. And the way we weighted essentially the first 8 factors, the performance metrics account for 50% of a city's livability score, and the perception ranking counts for the other 50%. So when we take those perception results of the survey, all the data that we've collected, we do get a slightly different result. You see that Paris ranks #1 in our livability score, New York, London, Tokyo. So the top 4 are still the same. The order changed slightly. You see Rome, Barcelona. But interesting here where you see a city like Vienna that wasn't ranked top 10 in terms of its perception, but its strong performance across these various metrics helps propel that city into the top 10 here at #7. So that's livability. Let's talk about lovability. And lovability really speaks, as I mentioned earlier, to the relative vibrancy of a region. This has really been one of the things that's differentiated our rankings since the beginning, is looking at these experiential factors. I think all rankings, we all have access to the same quantitative metrics, whether that's air quality, whether it's job opportunities, whether it's number of Fortune 500 companies, etc. But what has always made the best cities rankings unique has been the incorporation of experiential factors like culture, sports, dining, nightlife. And the reason that we've always incorporated those experiential factors is because they have always shown the highest correlations with visitor attraction and visitor expenditure. And as I mentioned earlier, now they're showing not only correlations with visitor expenditure, but talent migration and where prime age population is located, and more importantly, also where businesses are being formed. So these experiential factors that we started collecting 10 years ago from a tourism and a destination development perspective, now we're seeing are also key drivers of talent attraction and economic development as well. So these are all user-generated data points. So we're going into TripAdvisor, looking at the number of nightlife experiences, the number of restaurants, shopping experiences, number of concerts, shows, and events, number of attractions that are catered to families. And TripAdvisor is sometimes cited, it's not necessarily the most comprehensive source, but it is the most consistent at a global level. That said, obviously, most of the people that use TripAdvisor are English speaking, whether they're coming from Europe or whether they're coming from the US. So we do acknowledge that there is a bit of a Western bias in the rankings because of the data platforms that we're using. When we've done Asia Pacific analysis, we've looked at trip.com, also trying to find other sources on a regional basis. But when you're looking at globally, we have selected and chosen the most widely used travel website to collect this information. Then we're also looking at number of Facebook check-ins. We're looking at number of Instagram hashtags. We're looking at a city's Google Trend score. Again, these are Western media sources, so that does create a bit of a bias for against cities, let's say in China. But we do use different sources for those Asia Pacific rankings when it comes to looking at that particular part of the world. So you have an interesting blend here that ultimately the goal here is not to quantify exactly how many restaurants there are from one city to the next, but use this as a benchmark. And really what we're looking at is the ratio of how many restaurants are listed or dining experiences from one city to the next, through these platforms to understand the relative strength and vibrancy and the experiential quality. And of course, because we're looking at the number, this also does favor the larger population centers. When we do more specific analysis for a client, we can index that based on population size. But at this level, really, we're just looking at the absolute number of quality experiences in each of these different categories. So when you take, again, those perception scores, accounting for 50% of the ranking in terms of where people want to visit, and then taking all of the data we've collected for these metrics to create a performance score, blending those two together, here we see that London actually comes out on top as what we would say the world's most loved city because it performs so well on the perception level and on its actual strength from a pure performance perspective. Even though more people said in the survey they want to visit Paris, actually London, from an experiential perspective, outperforms Paris enough that it propels it into #1 for lovability. But again, you're seeing a lot of the same similar cities here in the top 5 from a lovability perspective. Barcelona pops in at #6, followed by Madrid. Then you have Dubai #8, and Berlin #9, followed by Singapore. And I think if you've thought about and we looked at and we pulled the visitation numbers, these would also prove out to be some of the 10 most visited cities in the world. So what we're seeing here does align with a lot of the behavior we see in terms of where people are traveling to. The last sector we'll talk about in the rankings here is the prosperity. So residence not only measures educational attainment and the percentage of people participating in the labor force, but we're also looking at things like the number of patents created. We're looking at the number of firms in professional and technical services. We're looking at factors related to infrastructure, like a region's airport and how connected it is to other cities around the world. We're looking at the ranking of universities and colleges to see the strength of the educational system is to fill the talent pipeline that companies are looking for. So here again, you have an interesting mix of sort of people-related factors and hardware-related factors. So there's the educational attainment of the population, We're looking at labor force participation, the number of corporate headquarters from the Fortune 500, things like airport connectivity, I mentioned, the size of a convention center that has not only a relationship with the number of visitors a city attracts, but actually also the number of businesses that form in a city. We're looking at things like unemployment rates, also looking at poverty rates, looking at GDP per capita as a measure of productivity. So there's a wide range of different factors here that are related to the strength of a city's business economy and the ecosystem for business, but also the prosperity and how shared that prosperity is amongst local residents. So again, here when we take the scores for the factors that we looked at as it related to perception of place, and then we combine that with the performance scores in each of these different factors to get that 50% perception, 50% performance score. You get a slightly different list here. Again, you'll see New York, London, Paris at the top of the list. But then you have a city like San Francisco. And San Francisco, that didn't pop up as the top 10 in terms of places most lovable or most livable, was certainly recognized globally as a place in terms of job opportunities. And then the underlying fundamental indicators of the strength of San Francisco, not just in terms of the tech that is located in Silicon Valley and the surrounding area, but as you look at a lot of those underlying factors like airport connectivity, the university ranking, GDP per capita that propels San Francisco here into the top 5. You'll also may notice that Singapore, Tokyo are in there, and Berlin as on the other lists, and Dubai. But we have a city like Doha that appears, again, driven not so much by perception, but its strong performance across these various indicators from an economic perspective, propels Doha into the top 10 for prosperity. And then same thing for Los Angeles. Again, the strength of the economy in Los Angeles across all of these different factors that we're looking at, whether that's educational institutions, whether it's convention center, whether it's airport connectivity, GDP per capita, propels Los Angeles into the top 10 here for prosperity. So let's come back to think about how the overall rankings are developed, is really looking at it through the lens of livability, the survey results, the performance metrics we've created to create a livability ranking, the lovability metrics that we've collected, and the survey results to determine a lovability ranking, and the prosperity metrics and the survey results to determine a prosperity ranking. And then the overall rankings are really the blend of these 3 scores together to give us an overall perception of a measure of the perception and performance combined together of these world cities overall. And as we noted when we released the report, despite the change in evolution in the methodology and adding the survey results, London still comes out as the #1 city for the 10th year in a row, followed closely by New York, Paris, and Tokyo. I think what's interesting as you look beyond kind of the top 10 here is you do see a city like Amsterdam at number 11. We get into looking at cities here where San Francisco is at 12, Dubai 13th, Los Angeles, Toronto at 15, Seoul, Chicago, Vienna mentioned the strength of Vienna from a livability perspective. Helps bring it up into the top 20. And then you have Seattle and Milan. And I think what's important to note as we look at the rankings, often say that the rankings are entertaining, they can be provocative. And the goal here is not just to determine which 1 city or 5 cities or 10 cities are the best cities for everything. Obviously, it depends on your perspective and your point of view and your objectives, that there is a wide breadth of cities that appeal to people for different reasons. Again, whether that's as a place to live, as a place to visit. And really the insights come when we unpack this data and we focus it on a more regional level, more specific indicators, and we drill down to understanding, well, what is shaping the performance of Vienna from a livability perspective, let's say, or Seattle from an economic perspective, and what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of those particular cities versus a more focused regional competitive set versus comparing them to all cities around the world. Of course, the cities at the top of the list like to tout their particular ranking and their performance, and they should. They are really, to be in the top of the list here means that you're performing well, both for perception and for performance across all 3 spectrums. And that should be noted that there are some smaller cities here, whether that's Barcelona and Amsterdam and Vienna that are really, and Seattle that are really packing a punch in terms of outsized performance relative to some of these, much larger cities around the world. So let's kind of wrap up and sort of we've talked about this as sort of what are the secrets or of the world's best cities, but give some takeaways here, and then we can jump into some Q&A if you want to pop some questions into the Q&A. Or the chat. We'll jump to those here in a second. I think one of the key takeaways here is that really we have to think about the key factors that, whether it's visitor attraction, talent formation, business formation, are becoming increasingly aligned. I think that's one of the high level, regardless of what the rankings tell us and where cities are positioned from one place to another, the analysis of these factors and the relationship that they have, even though that analysis is based in the US, we see similar behavior. Some of the factors might be different and are different in European context or in an Asia Pacific context. But we can start to think about whether it's visitor attraction or talent attraction or economic development, that these factors are now overlapping with one another more than ever before. I think one of the other kind of key takeaways is that, the largest cities still command the most attention. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have 700 some cities that were mentioned in the survey, but only 50 that were mentioned by 1% or more of survey respondents. And I think, what that tells us is that you'll never have, whether you're in economic development, destination development, you'll never be able to market yourself to change perception of your place just through marketing. And that the strength of a lot of these cities and what's shaping their performance is based on the number of place-based assets that they have within their city. So that doesn't mean that this is just the exclusive purview of the largest cities. As I mentioned, there are cities like Barcelona, Amsterdam, Vienna, Seattle that are mid-sized cities that are working their way up perception-wise into the top 20 rankings. But I think they're doing that based on the quality of either the housing and livability, or the economy in terms of job opportunities, or experiential in terms of the assets that city offers from a vibrancy perspective. So that we have to think about this as not just a marketing problem, although sometimes we do identify cities where the perception doesn't match the performance and they might have a marketing-based problem. But more often than not, cities have a place-based asset problem in terms of looking at how do we invest in and create more things that will stimulate visitor demand, talent attraction, and business formation. So if you are a smaller city, I think that's one of the other kind of takeaways here, is that you really have to have a positioning strategy that complements rather than competes with these larger cities. So how do we think about and look at your city within the context of some of these regions? And within each of these regions, there is sort of a super place power, whether that's, Singapore and Asia Pacific context, whether it's London and Paris in a European context, or whether it's New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles, Chicago in an American context. We have to think about, well, how does your particular city or place complement those rather than competes directly in terms of trying to be something for everyone? And I'll give you an example of our work with Brussels. For example, Brussels is the capital of the EU. It's very successful business-wise, and there's a lot of expats that live in Brussels. But Brussels is competing with the Parises and the Londons, of course, in very close proximity. And a lot of our strategy in the development and what we learned there was for Brussels to really position itself as a place for individuals, that it was a place where you could be yourself relative to trying to fit in London or fit in Paris. So that doesn't mean that Brussels is the only place that can tell that story and that narrative, but it was about how does it tell a story and a narrative that makes it unique and articulates that differentiation relative to those place superpowers around it. I think another key point, and this comes up a lot, and we get asked about sustainability. And we have included factors like air quality, including tree cover in terms of looking at that as a measure for heat resilience is something that we've added this year. Those today don't show strong correlations with visitor attraction or talent formation or business formation. But we do believe that we have to be conscious of the fact that the climate is changing and that we do believe that over time, it won't be next year or the year after, but as we think about the development and perception of cities in the decades to come, as the effects of climate change continue to impact cities, that these environmental factors will begin to play a larger and larger role in location-based decisions, whether that's for visitation, whether that's for talent, or whether that's for business formation. So we are including those indicators. I think as over time, we'll start to see, we hear and through different surveys and work with clients that sustainability is recognized as being important, but we can't yet demonstrate that it's having an effect on location decisions yet. But that's something that we're monitoring closely and will probably be something that becomes more and more of a factor in the next 10 years of doing Best Cities reports. I think the last kind of key takeaway, and then jump in to see if there's any questions if you want to pop those in, is that the factors driving talent, tourism, and investment traction, as I mentioned at the beginning, are becoming increasingly aligned. But one of the challenges we have in cities and all of the clients we work with is that the positioning and messaging, and really actually even the ecosystem in terms of how economic development, tourism development, destination marketing happens within a city is quite siloed. And if the factors are aligning, then our organizations need to align their positioning and messaging as well. So I look at this and think about it as, really sort of a virtuous circle here, that work and investment in destination development isn't just about attracting more visitors. That actually we need to be thinking about destination development as really driving economic development. As we noted in a lot of our research and the correlations and the factors here, that yes, culture, nightlife, restaurants, culinary scene, these are all important in attracting visitor expenditure. But they're equally or as important in attracting talent. And talent is required to power economic development. And a lot of these factors, nightlife stands out as one in particular that shows very high correlations with the number of businesses being formed within a city. So that's not to say that nightlife is causing business formation, but it shows us that to create a lot of strong startup culture and a startup scene within a city, that nightlife goes with that. And we need to be thinking about how we're developing these things together. At the same time, we need to think about economic development is helping drive the visitor economy as well. It was interesting in this latest analysis this year to see that, the number of healthcare and tech companies within a city had a strong relationship with visitor expenditure in the city. So as we think about economic development, tourism is not just driven by leisure travelers, tourism is also driven by business. We've seen a really robust recovery this year, unexpected in many ways, in terms of business travel in many different countries. There's no question that remote work and Zoom and webinars like this have replaced some of the need for travel. But when we look at meetings, events, conferences, they have fully recovered, and business travel is close behind that. And I expect next year we'll see that business travel has recovered and even exceeded pre-pandemic levels in many cities and different economies around the world. So investing in economic development is also about helping drive and support the visitor economy as well. And that these two things really need to be working in tandem together. So with that, I'll look in and pop in and see if we have any questions. If you want to put those in the Q&A, or we can pop into the chat here. There's a question here in the Q&A from Ocean about what do you see as the future of ranking efforts like this, especially in light of sweeping changes in new analytical capabilities coming from AI and the explosion of content creation as a possible source of qualitative data. So there's a lot to unpack in there in particular. I think one of the things that made Best Cities interesting and unique from the beginning was incorporating way long before AI. We've been aggregating user-generated data. Obviously, there will be some new tools and capabilities with AI that will make our lives easier to help collect that data. I do think that that explosion of content creation creates some unique opportunities. One of the things that we've noticed, I think, are the effects over the last 10 years, whether it's through Instagram, and we include the number of Instagram mentions as a factor, was that these social media channels influence people to all want to do the same things in terms of having their photo taken in that same spot, capturing that same point of view, that same perspective. My hope with AI and kind of this explosion of content creation that you're talking about is that we'll see an even greater diversity of experiences recommended on whatever platforms those may be that are more personalized to your particular interests, so that we're not all going to a city all trying to get the same picture in Geld Park in Barcelona. We're actually going to see a particular bookstore or record shop or do a particular hike that suits our specific interests and capture more personal moments and memories out of these experiences. And that to me is one of the opportunities with AI, is to create more diverse recommendations rather than what has happened with social media, which is the consolidation of influences. And that should also open up some other sources of qualitative data. Residents will continue to look for and unpack new opportunities. I think that's been one of the hallmarks of these rankings, has been using non-traditional data sources that are user generated, and a combination now of qualitative and quantitative measures. So thanks for that question, Ocean. Um, Steve Luss has a question here about how influential are your rankings on city staff? I guess that depends on where they're ranked. Of course, those people that are at the top of the rankings, love the methodology and the approach. And of course, there are some that are dismissive of the approach because they don't like their ranking or don't like where they are perceived relative to some of their competing cities in the rankings. I would say that the smartest cities are the ones that do unpack this and let's look at it and understand, well, why are you ranking, where you're ranking? And we do work with cities ranging from Houston to Brussels, to Copenhagen, to Vancouver, to Toronto, to many, many other places in between that we have helped them unpack that. And that, as I said, their overall rankings are entertaining, they're provocative, they make great stories in the media, but the real insights come from drilling down into this on a more focused perspective. And hopefully that is where we are making a difference, is influencing policy by educating city leaders around what their particular strengths are and what their particular weaknesses are, in order to focus and prioritize their investments, because you can't do everything all at the same time. Having a positioning strategy, an economic development strategy, focused on a particular area, understanding the factors that are most important to achieving those results, can then help us create destination development plans or economic development strategies that are much more focused and hopefully much more effective because they've been informed by this data and this approach. There's an anonymous question here about surprising that environmental factors not playing a role in the perceived attractiveness of cities. Could you elaborate on the methodology that proves this? So we've been looking just purely based on the correlations between heat stress, tree cover, air quality, on where talent is migrating to. And just like housing, we can also see that people in general are moving to the least expensive, the least affordable cities. They are also moving to some of the least sustainable or some of the hottest places. So if I use the US for example, we've seen massive migration to cities in the Sun Belt, whether that's Phoenix, whether it's Atlanta, Dallas, Austin, Houston. These are the cities that are the hottest in the United States. So when we look at where the actual relationship between how people are behaving and the data points, we are not seeing people moving yet to the cooler places. We are starting to see, I think, maybe sort of the early signs when you look at tourism factors, this trend towards what people are calling coolcations, that we are starting to pick up some signals and some early data where you're looking at and seeing, well, yes, Greece is still really popular, but visitation to the Nordics countries in the summertime in Europe is growing faster than visitation to Greece. So I think those are just sort of the early signals that environmental factors are starting to play a growing role in our location decisions. And of course, as the effects of climate change accelerate, we don't know yet at what pace that will happen, How quickly they happen will probably influence how quickly environmental factors begin to impact our location decisions. I suspect at some point we'll hit a tipping point where they suddenly become very important, and we'll start to see some big shifts in terms of where people are moving and investing. There's a question here from Amanda about what conditions would be required to execute rankings for mid-sized cities. And we do rankings for smaller cities. We've done them in the US. Our European city rankings, we look at cities of 500,000 plus. So when we get down on a more regional context, we look at them on a smaller level. This year in the United States for our America's Best Cities report upcoming in 2025, we are looking at all 370 metropolitan areas in the United States, and then able to separate and look at, well, what are some of the differences in these factors for small cities, mid-sized cities, and large cities. So that is part of our goal and our process this year, is to now start to analyze and say, well, are these factors that are driving visitor expenditure and talent formation in large cities the same as smaller cities? So stay tuned for those rankings when they come out, and you'll see that in the America's ranking in 2025. Another anonymous question here is just about, is the approach for creating strategy for developing cities differ from big, developed, and rich cities? I think it absolutely does. So again, these rankings have a Western bias in terms of the data sources, and we're looking at the correlations of factors in US cities and European cities to determine what gets included in the rankings. So the rankings therefore then favor American and European cities. We are collecting data and for cities way beyond this. So we have over 500 cities in our database, many developing cities around the world. And of course, I think that when you look at some of those factors, that we do need to think about livability, for example, becomes much more of a priority in developing cities, things, whether it's air quality, congestion, traffic, that, before we can be talking a lot about nightlife in a particular city, we need to make sure people have access to clean water, to housing, and that's part of our Asia Pacific cities ranking. Actually has an interesting blend when that report comes out in February, of cities across India, China, and you get very different results, and you're looking at it through different lens, different factors in that part of the world than when we look at it in a global context. So I think there's another question here about Copenhagen. Copenhagen is considered one of the best cities for living, but it's not reflected on the ranking. What are your thoughts on this? Yes, Copenhagen is, I don't know off the top of my head, around 50-ish in the middle of the rankings. And Copenhagen is one of the most livable cities. So it is in the rankings. Copenhagen doesn't have the same global appeal. It is one of those 1% cities, so it is in the 50 cities that were kind of mentioned and recognized, but it's a smaller city. I think Copenhagen is an amazing place. It's one of my favorite cities to visit, and I think that it has a lot of the conditions to be a world's best city and move up the rankings. As if we think about sustainability, environmental factors, Copenhagen is well ahead of other cities as it relates to investing in and making sustainability a priority, which is the right decision and the right move. And I think you'll see over time, as the world catches up and recognizes that those factors are important, cities like Copenhagen will excel in the rankings in the future. Question here from Carolina about, since the first 10 rarely changes for the last 10 years, I really have to see what happens in the other 10s, like positions 30 to 100. Yes, we do have all of that data, and you do see a lot more variability in those city rankings, particularly now that we've incorporated the perception data. So there are cities, and if you look at, say, the Mercer rankings and the Economist for livability, you'll see cities like in Australia, Melbourne, Sydney, cities in Canada like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, always score very high in those livability rankings. And now that we've included their perception data, they perform quite well in the survey. So those cities have moved up significantly in our rankings as a result of the inclusion of that perception data. But I always caution people that, so the perception of some of these cities is great, but maybe the performance doesn't actually warrant that particular ranking when you get into some of the areas, whether it's economic or environmental, et cetera. And that's really where we can work with a lot of these cities to help them unpack and understand what's driving that. But it is more interesting, actually, and insightful to look at those cities from 30 to 100 and actually those cities that are outside of 100 as well. So that's a great point. Great. Thanks for that question. An anonymous attendee asked here, what's the best example of great city branding? We could probably do a whole webinar on that, and we have done webinars with our VP Strategy, Jeremy Feinblatt, specifically on place branding. You can look for that online on our YouTube channel and access that to get into that. I think I would say I won't point out on one particular city, but I think the best examples of city branding are the organizations that are really kind of aligning economic development and destination development together and developing common narrative, common strategy. And I guess I will call out one, which is London and Partners. Not surprising that obviously they're number one in our rankings, but I think they're also one of the best in terms of how are they administering and managing the city from an economic development, destination development, talent attraction, startup formation, investment. And it really is by uniting all of their into what they call a growth agency. So it's not about tourism, it's not about economic development, it's about uniting forces together as you think about the sustainable growth of a city, conscious also of the quality of life. So I think that's a great, an example of an organization. But there are smaller cities like Amsterdam that have done, similar work to create a city branding department. So to me, it's less about the logo or the result or what we see, and much more about how is the city organizing itself to manage itself as a destination. Questions keep coming in, so I'll keep going if we have a few more minutes here. There's a question here from Leo about a big jump this year over year in lovability for Ottawa. Could you elaborate on which criteria drove this lovability growth? This is an example, as I was just mentioning, the perception results. So if you got a score perception as a place people wanted to visit, that moved you up in the rankings. So the experiential quality, let's say, of Ottawa may not have changed much year over year. But the fact that people perceived Ottawa as a desirable place to visit helped move it up in the rankings. And that's also true of Toronto, Calgary, of all the Canadian cities, actually. So their lovability scores all improved based on their results in the perception survey, not necessarily because they improved on Instagram or their restaurants or nightlife scene improved. There are some noticeable differences that we could unpack and get into. Ottawa is a city that we work with. But generally speaking, a lot of those big jumps for cities is based on their perception scores that we added this year. And the last question here about how important is it to consider the kind of data sets when developing strategies for cities? Where does it make the best impact in the process? So of course, yeah, when you're choosing different statistics, you can choose different data sources to tell different kinds of stories. I think we consider it important to use a broad set of data sets and look at it through these three different lenses. Of course, this is our particular perspective and point of view, but I think what often happens in economic development strategies is they would only look at the economic factors and the prosperity factors. And if you're doing a tourism strategy or destination development strategy, you would only look at the factors related to visitors or what we call lovability. And I think it's important, and what we force all of our clients to do, whether it's an economic development project, a place branding project, a tourism development strategy, is to look at it through all three lenses, because that always reveals some interesting insights that are unexpected in different ways. So that is one last question popped in here, and we'll wrap up here. They're a notable city that focused on innovative ways of designing city experiences. Can you give an example of those experiences? I'll call out, one of our clients, I think, is the city of Christchurch in New Zealand. And I think this is actually also a good example that they've created an integrated organization called Christchurch NZ. We worked with them on a place branding strategy and on a destination development plan. So linking those two together of this is the opportunity and positioning for the city. How do we realize that positioning? And the positioning for Christchurch was really around being a city of play. And looking at how it differentiated itself from Wellington and Auckland, other cities in New Zealand. And the way they brought that positioning to life, wasn't necessarily, our work, but was actually creating a day of play in the city, and also looking at and investing in a whole placemaking program around creating playful experiences in the city. And I think that that's a great example, as I mentioned earlier, of choosing a lane, like not trying to compete and be everything to everyone, but finding an element of truth that's authentic to what makes your city or destination different, and not just telling that through marketing, but living it through the development of activities, festivals, events, attractions, experiences. And I think Christchurch has done a phenomenal job of working on bringing that positioning to life. So with that, I'll wrap up here, and we used our full hour just about. Thanks so much for joining us. I know an hour is always a big chunk out of everyone's day, particularly as we head into the holidays in some countries. Want to just share with you, if you're interested in learning how we use all of this data to inform strategies, whether that's tourism, economic development, or branding, feel free to reach out to me at cfair@resonanceco.com. I'd love to chat and learn more about what some of the challenges or opportunities you see for your particular city and how we might be able to help. And encourage everyone just to stay ahead of what's going on by subscribing to our newsletter, resonanceco.com/newsletter. You can sign up and receive our monthly newsletter where we release ongoing insights and reports. And of course, you can follow us on LinkedIn and track where all of our team is and some of the different insights as we move around the world and work with cities here in the US, Canada, Europe, Asia Pacific, and many places in between in 2025. So thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone that is here in North America and Europe has restful holidays. You have good celebrations in other parts of the world as we move into 2025, which looks to be not only an exciting year, but an interesting one with all of the dynamics in terms of geopolitics that are going on. There's no shortage of challenges, but there's also lots of opportunities, and we look forward to tracking those and sharing our research and insights with you in the year to come. Thanks, everyone.